President, one of the factors that has worsened the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and which is affecting more than half of the population, that's to say more than 18 million people, has been the decline in the economy, where the real GDP has not grown since the beginning of the war. The paralysis in oil exports and the high domestic prices continue to negatively affect economic activity and are bringing pressure to bear on the government budget and foreign currency reserves. And the war, together with the havoc brought on by climate change, has paralyzed agricultural production, which is leading to fears of a worsening of the food insecurity situation, as pointed out in the IPC Hunger report. During its recent visit to Yemen, a team from the International Monetary Fund concluded that external financing will be essential in order to maintain macroeconomic stability and to fund humanitarian needs. That should include actions to address the increase in the cases of cholera and to support the process of economic reform. Nevertheless, all of these actions will be in vain unless tangible progress is made in the peace process, as well as in the reduction of regional tensions. That is why Ecuador supports the efforts of the Special Envoy to make progress in the implementation of the roadmap under the auspices of the United Nations, and urges states, particularly those in the region, to support such efforts. In conclusion, I reaffirm my country's condemnation of the detention of humanitarian personnel by the Houthis. They are protected by international humanitarian law, including the recently approved Resolution 2730. And we join our voice to others who have called for their immediate and unconditional release. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for the statement. I now give the floor to representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank our two speakers for the overview that they have just presented to us, as somber as that may be. Switzerland strongly condemns the recent arbitrary detention of humanitarian and UN personnel by the Houthis. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those that have been detained. We are concerned by the significant and rapid deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Yemen, and we recall that it is essential for humanitarian actors to have unhindered access to the civilian population. As Resolution 2730 recalls, these personnel are protected by international humanitarian law. These arrests considerably worsen an already particularly tense situation in Yemen. In view of the worrying assessment presented by the two senior UN representatives, Switzerland would like to highlight the following points. At the political level, the parties must refrain from any action that could jeopardize the conditions for implementing the roadmap. The regional repercussions of the situation in the Middle East have slowed down the momentum of the talks to which the Special Envoy is committed in order to reach an agreement. In this context, we reaffirm our full support for Hans Grundberg and his team. We also recall the importance of the exercise of navigation rights and freedoms in the Red Sea. As we have already stated on several occasions, all attacks must cease and the crew members of the Galaxy Leader must be released. As far as the humanitarian situation is concerned, the various indicators bear witness to the seriousness of the situation. Efforts to contain the cholera epidemic are hampered by the conflict, problems of access and the lack of resources. Landmines laid by the Houthis and other armed groups continue to kill and seriously injure civilians in areas where active hostilities have ceased. Finally, as we have seen since the truce of 2022, the conflict in Yemen has moved into the economic sphere. This crisis has worsened acutely in recent weeks. If no international money transfers are possible via the banks in Sana'a in the near future, humanitarian aid will be even more limited and the civilian population will be directly affected. The various measures taken by the parties to the conflict are stifling the private economy and hampering the import of essential goods. This is a further destabilization which is being borne entirely by the civilian population and which only serves to reinforce existing tensions. The oil sector has been seriously disrupted, as has the banking sector and, more recently, the telecommunications sector. The longer the conflict persists, the deeper these divisions become entrenched, making the prospect of future reunification a monumental task. Mr. President, the Security Council and the countries of the region must continue their efforts to contribute to an environment that is conducive to peace talks and to respond to the growing humanitarian needs. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for the statement. I now give the floor to representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Bosornu for their informative briefings. The situation surrounding Yemen remains highly volatile across multiple dimensions. Today, I would like to address 4 main points. First, Japan unequivocally condemns the Houthis' recent detention of 13 UN staff members as well as many NGO workers. Such detentions are totally unacceptable as they not only violate the rights of the victims, but also significantly undermine essential work by the United Nations in Yemen. It is unfortunate that the Security Council has failed to issue a press statement on this matter. The Council should swiftly speak up, condemn this outrageous conduct by the Houthis, and demand the immediate and unconditional release of the detainees. Second, Japan maintains its strong condemnation against the ongoing Houthis' attack on international shipping, as they have threatened the freedom of navigation and disrupted global supply chain. We also condemn that the Houthis have continued to hold the 25 crew members of Galaxy Leader for more than 200 days, another example of their detention tactics. The Houthis must immediately cease their attacks on vessels and unconditionally release the Galaxy Leader and its crew, consistent with Resolution 2722. Third, Japan is seriously worried about the persistently dire humanitarian situation in Yemen. We share the concern of Director Bosornu about food insecurity and widespread malnutrition, as well as the nationwide cholera outbreak. The international community should further strengthen their efforts to save the vulnerable Yemeni population, especially women and children. For our part, Japan has contributed approximately $46 million of humanitarian assistance in Yemen over the past 2 years and will continue to provide necessary assistance. We would like to once again reiterate that the safety of humanitarian aid workers must be fully respected, and their freedom of movement must be guaranteed. This is particularly essential at the time when more than half of the Yemeni depends on the basic humanitarian supplies like food and water. Fourth, and lastly, Japan deeply regrets that the current regional tensions have negatively affected the environment for peace talks and stagnated the peace process, including the exchange of prisoners. We share Special Envoy's frustration. Meanwhile, the intensification of hostilities between the Houthis and the government of Yemen on both the military and economic fronts is alarming. We believe that only a political settlement based on the inclusive and comprehensive national dialogue under the UN's auspices involving women, youth, and marginalized groups will resolve the decade-long conflict in Yemen. In this regard, Japan continues to support the critical mediating role of Special Envoy Grundberg and his office to end the plight of the Yemeni people. We also remain hopeful. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Envoy Gromberg and Director Vostruno for their sobering briefings today. To begin, let me express Malta's condemnation for the recent arrests and detention by the Houthis of United Nations personnel, civil society, and staff working for non-governmental organizations and diplomatic missions in Yemen. These detentions are unacceptable, and we demand their immediate and unconditional release. All parties to the conflict must fully comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. This includes their obligations related to the respect and protection of humanitarian workers and United Nations and associated personnel, including national and locally recruited staff. International law prohibits the arbitrary deprivation of liberty and requires all parties to armed conflict to respect and protect humanitarian personnel. We insist that they must not be subjected to any harassment, mistreatment, and unlawful arrest or detention. These arrests can have serious far-reaching ramifications on the delivery of humanitarian aid into and throughout Yemen, further aggravating the suffering of innocent civilians. The humanitarian situation remains dire, with more than 18 million people in need of assistance. The cholera outbreak continues to spread, with tens of thousands of suspected cases. Levels of food and nutrition insecurity remain alarmingly high, with the situation likely to worsen in the coming months in the lean season. Nearly 3 million people reside in areas at risk of deteriorating into emergency levels of food insecurity or worse. We are also distressed by reports of mothers going hungry to feed their children and call once again for sustained delivery of humanitarian aid and resourcing in order to ensure the most vulnerable are protected. In this regard, the international community must support a robust response to Yemen's humanitarian crisis. We call for the urgent scale-up of funding for Yemen's humanitarian response plan to ensure the delivery of aid to those in desperate need. President, conflict is the main driver of Yemen's humanitarian crisis. Tensions in Yemen and the region, including escalations in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, continue to disrupt mediation efforts, hamper progress towards a political solution, and risk the flow of humanitarian and commercial goods. We call on the Houthis to immediately cease all attacks and actions against commercial shipping. Parties to the conflict must prioritize de-escalation and dialogue. A nationwide ceasefire and the resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led and owned political process poses the only durable way forward to sustainable peace. To this end, we call on parties to constructively engage with the Office of the Special Envoy on commitments made to the UN roadmap. As we have heard again today, the protracted economic crisis continues to be a major driver of suffering in Yemen. Unilateral economic decisions and policies undertaken by parties to the conflicts are fragmenting Yemen's weak economy, driving instability and undermining steps towards a political solution. Parties should refrain from any action that will aggravate the suffering of the Yemenis people and hinder civilians' access to food and essential goods. We call on parties to adopt a strategic and coordinated response to face the challenges to Yemen's economy. In conclusion, Mr. President, after nearly a decade of conflict, Yemen faces the possibility of losing the progress made towards peace. Parties must de-escalate tensions, support humanitarian relief, and take decisive steps towards a ceasefire and political settlement. I thank you.
I thank the representative Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Guyana, Mozambique, and my own country, Sierra Leone. I would like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and OSHA Director of Operations and Advocacy, Eden Wosono, for their comprehensive updates and valuable insights about the security and humanitarian situation on the ground. We also welcome the participation of Yemen in this meeting. Mr. President, the A3 Plus joins other council members in expressing our grave concern over the detention of United Nations personnel working in Yemen, including humanitarian personnel. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all those detained and urge the Houthis to ensure their safety. We also express our grave concern about the devastating impact of the protracted conflict in Yemen and the persistent stalemate among the parties on the lives and livelihoods of its people. Over the past decade, this conflict has resulted in countless deaths and unimaginable suffering for the people of Yemen. With more than 80 million people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, we need to redouble diplomatic efforts to bring this conflict to an end. We are aware of the complex political landscape in which the UN Special Envoy functions, and we commend his efforts to engage the various parties on resuming political talks. The A3 Plus family believes that lasting peace and progress in the political talks can only be achieved through a Yemeni-owned and led political process, which must include the meaningful participation of women and youths. In this regard, we'd like to make the following points. Firstly, efforts to restart political talks and addressing the situation in a sustainable manner requires an integrated approach. In line with relevant Security Council resolutions, we stress the need for all stakeholders to be fully engaged in the political process. We reiterate the need for decisive steps towards a sustainable ceasefire and our strong support for efforts towards a political settlement that will ultimately end the suffering of the Yemeni people. The Special Envoy has a key role to play in rebuilding the momentum of the peace talks, and we reiterate our support for his efforts towards a negotiated, inclusive, Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political settlement based on the agreed references and in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. The facilitating role of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman and other regional actors is crucial. The active involvement of civil society, women's groups, and the youth is paramount in all aspects of the peace process. Despite the challenges, we believe that through dialogue, diplomacy, and negotiation, the parties can take courageous steps towards a peaceful and sustainable solution for Yemen to be operationalized through a UN roadmap. Secondly, we stress the need to de-escalate the economic war and to urgently address the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen. The Yemeni economy has been devastated by the conflict, and the retaliatory monetary and fiscal policy measures have worsened the situation. While we underscore the obligation of Yemeni financial institutions to comply with banking laws and regulations and the importance of safeguarding the banking sector, we urge the parties to the conflict to spare the country's economy from further collapse and to refrain from taking measures that will further divide the banking system in Yemen. We further urge regional stakeholders to include in the peace process measures to resolve the divide in the banking system with a view to addressing the depreciation of the Yemeni rial and worsening humanitarian conditions. Along the same line, we reiterate our support for the Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan and urge the international community to address the significant funding gap in order to effectively address the needs of the Yemeni people. Increased humanitarian aid is crucial to prevent widespread famine and disease outbreaks. It is also essential that movement restrictions on women be lifted to facilitate their unhindered access to humanitarian aid. Beyond providing life-saving humanitarian support, there is an urgent need to reverse years of infrastructural and institutional damage in the country. Thirdly, we are gravely concerned about the security situation in the Red Sea and call on the Houthis to refrain from the escalatory actions. The prolonged Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden continue to pose an unacceptable danger to maritime vessels, shipping companies, and regional and global trade. The level of aggression has turned the conflict in Yemen into a mutually punishing stalemate. The A3 Plus reiterates its condemnation of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. We demand that the Houthis immediately and unconditionally cease all such attacks and refrain from taking any further provocative actions, and urge them to prioritize political and diplomatic means in solving the situation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Mr. President, the A3 Plus demands the full implementation of the Security Council resolutions aiming at achieving an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. This will de-escalate tensions in the region. In closing, the A3 Plus stands by the Yemeni people and reiterates its support for an inclusive political process that will guarantee the peace and development of Yemen. We urge all parties to commit to constructive dialogue and genuine effort towards reconciliation, ensuring that the voices and needs of all Yemenis are respected and addressed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, признательны спецпосланнику генерального секретаря по Йемену Хансу Грюнбергу и директору КГБ по операциям МВД Басорну за доклады о политической и гуманитарной обстановке в этой стране. Обстановка в Йемене и вокруг него не располагает к мирным переговорам.
Apologies, the microphone was off. There's interpretation.
Господин
Mr. President, we are grateful to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, and the Director of OCHA, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Madam Borsunu, for the reports on the political and humanitarian situation in that country. The situation within and around Yemen does not lend itself to peace talks. And the reason behind this is instability in the region, first and foremost, the ongoing escalation in Gaza. Such a large-scale crisis hotspot in the neighborhood cannot but impact processes underway in Yemen. Also significantly thwarting peace efforts is the ongoing militarization of the Red Sea and the Yemeni waters. We view as unacceptable attacks on civilian vessels navigating in the Red Sea. We call for an immediate end to the strikes against commercial vessels and any other actions which prevent maritime navigation. We demand the release of the crew of the Galaxy Leader. At the same time, we condemn the strikes by the US and UK-led coalition targeting the sovereign territory of Yemen. This aggression is being perpetrated in violation of the UN Charter. It is pointless insofar as it cannot stop attacks in the Red Sea. Furthermore, as with other countries of the Middle East and North Africa, these reckless instances of use of force by NATO countries leave behind them a blood-stained a stain of blood in the form of countless civilian casualties and devastation of civilian infrastructure. These kinds of illegitimate military interventions cannot be justified either by invoking Resolution 2722, nor by referring to the right to self-defense pursuant to Article 51 of the UN Charter. On the 31st of May alone, as a result of a missile strike on the Yemeni province of Hodeidah, as has been reported, 16 people died, and another 35 corrects the speaker, were wounded. These kinds of actions not only fail to help normalize the situation in the waters of the Red Sea, on the contrary, they continue to further the spiral of violence. We call upon Western delegations to acknowledge the fact that in order to address the situation within Yemen and in neighboring waters, what is necessary are comprehensive political diplomatic efforts, not what is customary for the West, their aggressive strikes. First and foremost, there is a need to expeditiously bring about an end to the violence in the Gaza Strip.
President, we support the efforts of the Special Envoy, Mr. Grunberg. We believe that one shouldn't wait for the situation in the Red Sea to change. There's a need to step up work with the parties to the Yemeni conflict, seeking to expeditiously transition to implementation of the existing roadmap and to turn to implementation of a full-fledged intra-Yemeni normalization process. The situation on the ground where large-scale military hostilities have been halted for some time now grants an opportunity to step up reconciliation efforts. There's a need for urgent action to address the deteriorating humanitarian situation. There is nearly half of the country's population is in need of humanitarian assistance. The Yemeni people need to have unfettered access to food, medicines, and other basic necessities in all the territory of Yemen on a non-discriminatory basis. Any limitations on or restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian assistance and any obstacles to the work of humanitarian workers are unacceptable. We see the stark underfinancing of specialized humanitarian programs. In order to address this situation, there's a need to bring in the efforts of all international stakeholders. President, the Russian Federation, like other delegations, has been learned with alarm about the recent detention in Yemen of 13 UN staff who, during the course of their work. There's a need to get to the bottom of the circumstances behind what transpired before flinging accusations against any party. We repeatedly heard from the representatives of some states that there's a need to provide time for quiet diplomacy when the matter is related to grave allegations against staff of UN agencies. Let us recall that in the past, some of the members of the Security Council present, refused to condemn the beating and detention of a UN mission in Kosovo's staff member, Mr. Krasnoshokov. Unfortunately, the council was unable to send a clear message regarding the catastrophic situation around UNRWA in Gaza, where the number of the dead humanitarian personnel is nearly 200. Of course, the situation around the detained is very serious, but it is of principled importance to avoid double standards in the consideration of required by the United Nations need to be protected to an equal extent. For our part, we intend to continue to deliver every possible form of assistance to Mr. Grunberg in clarifying the circumstances and gaining access to UN personnel. All illegitimately detained UN personnel need to be released. Mr. President, we welcome the operations of the UN mission in Hodeidah, UNRWA, to implement the Stockholm Agreement on the Yemeni ports of Hodeidah, Salif, and Ras Issa. We consistently advocate de-escalation in Hodeidah and maintenance of the civilian nature of the operations of its ports. We call on the parties to constructively cooperate with UNRWA. And we stand ready to continue to deliver its General Michael Berry, the head of this body, every possible assistance in its work, and we support the forthcoming extension of the mandate of the mission to be carried out in July. The Russian Federation continues to maintain close contacts with all Yemeni protagonists and parties engaged in the conflict, who are, and this is geared towards prompting them to exercise restraint, maintain a constructive approach, and a willingness to engage in compromise. We believe there is no alternative to a political solution. And at the same time, we continue to believe that the Security Council should closely study the prospects for the resumption of the international legal basis for Yemeni settlement in order to ensure that this reflects realities on the ground. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also want to thank our briefers this morning, Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Vosornu of OCHA. I also welcome the Ambassador of Yemen in the chamber. President, we meet today regrettably seeing continuing challenging conditions to peace, since our last discussion in this chamber. We continue to urge all actors to prioritize the Yemeni people and to engage in good faith with the Special Envoy's three-pronged approach, which should lead to a roadmap agreement in an inclusive intra-Yemeni process. This approach has Slovenia's full support, the support of this Council and the broader international community. The significant gains made up until the end of 2023 should not be reversed, and hope should not be lost for the sake of the Yemeni people. It is imperative that all efforts are devoted to ensuring the establishment of conditions in which Yemeni society can begin to recover and rebuild, most of all the conditions for peace, safety, and security. President, the detention in recent days by Houthis of a number of UN and NGO personnel and staff in Yemen is deeply disturbing. We unequivocally condemn these detentions. The incident follows an increasing erosion of respect for international humanitarian law and protection of humanitarian, medical, and UN personnel in conflict zones. This trend is worrying, and the Security Council should react consistently and firmly to these incidents. All parties to the conflict in Yemen should fully comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law. This includes obligations relating to the respect and protection of humanitarian personnel who are undertaking life-saving work on the ground. As the Director Vosorno and several colleagues before me, we recall that arbitrary deprivation of liberty is prohibited under international law. We also have serious concerns about the impact of these latest developments on the provision of humanitarian aid in Yemen, at a time when needs remain so high and the country continues to face one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The provision of aid, including the safe passage and conduct of humanitarian activities by the aid workers, is an obligation under international law. Slovenia calls for immediate, safe, and unconditional release of all those detained in the past days by Houthis, as well as those detained previously and held for a number of years. And we support Envoy's effort in that regard. President, unilateral economic decisions, of which we heard today from both briefers, are only exacerbating an already dire situation in Yemen. They risk complicating humanitarian operations and affecting commercial imports. This is against the backdrop of a worrying cholera outbreak, continuing displacement crisis, unrelenting climate-related challenges, rising levels of food insecurity, and reprehensible attacks in the Red Sea, which have not ceased in spite of demands by this Council. We therefore call for an immediate end to economic hostilities by all actors, given the extremely fragile economic and humanitarian landscape in the country. We also call upon the parties to engage constructively with the Special Envoy to find mutually acceptable solutions which can stabilize the economic situation and unlock Yemen's true economic potential. President, at this sensitive juncture, all parties should prioritize de-escalation, dialogue, and diplomacy. The benefits of long-term peace for Yemen should remain our driving force. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Vosorno, for your briefings. I also welcome the representative of Yemen to this meeting. Mr. President, the United States is deeply disturbed by reports that Houthi rebels detained at least 50 Yemeni employees of UN agencies, member state diplomatic missions, private companies, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations. These detentions include 13 UN employees. The humanitarian situation in Yemen remains difficult, and Yemenis need the support of the international community now more than ever. The detention of UN and NGO staff directly and negatively affects the ability for organizations to provide humanitarian aid. These actions further call into question the Houthis' commitment to doing what is in the best interests of the Yemeni people. Instead, it shows their focus on their own ideological goals. We condemn these detentions, and we echo Secretary General Guterres' strong and clear call for the Houthis to release these detainees immediately we are disappointed that this council could not reach consensus in echoing the Secretary General's call. We also strongly condemn Houthi efforts to spread disinformation regarding the role of detained U.S. current and former local staff through televised, forced, and phony so-called confessions. Yet again, the Houthis are seeking to use disinformation to distract from their failures to meet the needs of the Yemeni people. The simple fact is that the Houthis have held these individuals without justification for more than 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Their detention, alongside that of the UN staff, is an affront to international norms. They should all be released immediately. Despite clear warnings and unified condemnation from countries around the world, the Houthis also have continued their reckless attacks in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and surrounding waterways, with growing negative implications for peace and security, as well as global trade. The Houthis must abide by Resolution 2722 and immediately cease their attacks on commercial and merchant vessels. Doing so would enable the unimpeded delivery of food and supplies into ports in Yemen, as well as to Sudan and other countries with populations in desperate need. Failing that, the Council must remain seized with this issue and must extend the requirement for continued reporting by the Secretary General under Resolution 2722 to ensure that it has accurate and timely information to inform its deliberations over this clear threat to navigational rights and freedoms, as well as peace and security. Colleagues, we call your attention to the fact that numerous documented vessels have docked at Houthi-controlled ports without UNVIM inspection since October 2023. These failures to submit to UNVIM inspection highlight the need for member states to invest in UNVIM and ensure that essential goods and not weapons supporting the Houthis' reckless campaign are reaching Yemen. We look forward to conversations with stakeholders about how we can strengthen UNVIM's mandate and ensure its financial security moving forward. Its work is vital and must be supported. Further, reports published by news agencies directly affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are now publicly and openly touting that Iran has been supplying anti-ship ballistic missiles to the Houthis. These announcements further validate what we have long said about Iran's provision of advanced weapons to the Houthis in violation of Security Council resolutions. Iran continues to directly support and enable Houthi attacks in the Red Sea region, and its continued and brazen violations of the arms embargo should not be overlooked by this Council. Iran should not be permitted to hide behind the Houthis. It must comply with the Council's resolutions and cease its provision of weapons. Colleagues, the time has come for Council action to ensure compliance with the arms embargo and put a stop to the unprecedented violations of UN sanctions. These transgressions make abundantly clear that the Houthis are the primary actor jeopardizing a political resolution between the Yemeni parties. As such, we should view their recent unilateral release of detainees with skepticism and more indicative of posturing to improve their position in advance of potential UN-led negotiations, which should not proceed absent a halt to maritime attacks. We continue to believe the UN's inclusive roadmap remains a better path, one that could hopefully lead to a durable end to the conflict that addresses Yemeni calls for justice, accountability, and redress for human rights abuses and violations by all parties in Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of the Republic of Korea. I also would like to thank Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and OCHA Director Adam Wersonu for the briefings. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen to this meeting. In the midst of the compounding crisis the Yemeni people are facing, shocking news surfaced last week of new Houthi detentions of UN personnel and the staff working for international and national NGOs and diplomatic missions. My delegation strongly condemns these latest detentions and demands for the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees. The Houthis' action is particularly alarming given that their reckless and unlawful attacks against vessels, including missile attacks on 2 commercial vessels in the Gulf of Aden over the weekend, remain ongoing. Detaining UN personnel, including staff working to meet the great humanitarian needs of Yemeni people on the ground, is simply unacceptable. Such flagrant actions undermine the international community's efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis and endanger other humanitarian workers. We stress the need to ensure safe, rapid, and unimpeded access for all humanitarian actors and protect them in accordance with international humanitarian law. The Republic of Korea also expresses its concerns over the worsening economic situation in Yemen due to hostile Houthis acts, such as the issuance of 100 real coins, which triggered countermeasures by Yemen's government. Economic confrontation at this juncture will exacerbate liquidity crisis, leading to a further contraction of vital humanitarian activities and additional difficulties for the Yemeni people in accessing key commodities such as food and medicine. Furthermore, economic uncertainties combined with volatile security conditions will only hinder efforts to resume political dialogue in Yemen and may even raise military tensions. Without economic stability throughout all of Yemen, a peaceful political transition process would not be realized, and the dire humanitarian situation will continue. In addition, without a durable political settlement, the multifaceted crisis will not be solved. This is why we once again emphasize that a holistic and strategic response is needed more than ever. And in this context, we reiterate our support for the tireless efforts by Special Envoy Grunberg to tackle ongoing challenges in Yemen and move forward to an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition process under UN auspices. It is imperative for all Yemeni parties, notably the Houthis, to stick to the negotiation process to establish a concrete and durable political settlement. At the same time, we hope for a successful implementation of the deal to achieve an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and release of hostages as soon as possible, which will lead to de-escalation of the tensions in the wider region, including Yemen. Finally, as the chair of the Sanctions Committee on Yemen, the Republic of Korea warmly welcomes the appointment of 2 additional experts of the panel on international humanitarian law and armed groups. With the addition of their expertise, we hope that the panel will be able to analyze the interconnected and complex issues in Yemen in a comprehensive manner. I look forward to the final report with their findings and recommendations. I resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to thank you for your stewardship of the Council during this month, and I would like to thank your predecessor, the Ambassador of Mozambique, for the successful presidency last month. We also wish to thank Mr. Hans Grunberg and Madam Edem Vasornu for their briefings. Mr. President, the Yemeni government condemns in the strongest terms the abduction by the terrorist Houthi militias of 13 UN staff, as well as staff from international and local humanitarian agencies, as well as international and local agencies in Sana'a. This constitutes an egregious violation of international humanitarian law and a direct threat to, and this poses a direct threat to the life and safety of these civil servants. We deplore the fact that the members of the Security Council have not been able to reach consensus regarding a press statement related to the abductions. We wish to recall that the Yemeni government for years warned warned about the atrocities perpetrated by the Houthis, their use of blackmail and the pressure that they have been bringing to bear on humanitarian organizations working in Yemen to advance their political agenda for humanitarian assistance to be used for the furtherance of their security and military objectives, and to transform the regions under their control as a prison for all of those who oppose their repressive policies. We firmly, moreover, condemn the judgments of the death penalties handed down by the illegal entities affiliated with the Houthi militias against 45 detainees. These were arbitrarily done. People who were forced to thrown into prisons where they have been languishing since last year. There were unfounded violations, unfounded allegations, which runs counter to IHL, international law, as well as all conventions and rules at the international rules and regulations. The Yemeni government has spared no effort in cooperation with the United Nations through the Office of the Special Envoy and international organizations, relevant international organizations. No effort has been spared to find a solution to the question of detainees and persons who have been forcibly displaced. We've been seeking to release them and to alleviate their suffering and to alleviate the suffering endured by their families on the basis of the all for all principle. Likewise, the Houthis are continuing to perpetrate atrocities, including the seizure of financial assets and the goods of individuals and businesses. And this includes the use of the judiciary to terrorize their opponents and to settle their accounts with their opponents. The terrorists have been continuing to adopt repressive policies to muzzle the people, to repress the freedom of expression, to terrorize and repress political figures and journalists, as well as the Yemeni population in areas under their control. They have been striving to prevent them from having opportunities to express themselves, denouncing the current situation, violating their right to a life of dignity. The citizens have been prevented from denouncing attempts to carry out efforts towards peace. We once again call upon the international community, the United Nations, and all human rights organizations to have their voice be heard, to condemn these criminal acts. The Yemeni government once again calls upon the UN and other international organizations to transfer the principal headquarters to the provisional capital Aden in order to establish appropriate and conducive conditions for the work of these organizations, and in order to allow them to deliver basic services to all people in Yemen in all regions without discrimination and without any obstacles. We renew our call for the UN mission to support the Hadeda Agreement, UNMAHA, to transfer its headquarters from areas controlled by Houthis in order to end the obstacles that have been imposed on the freedom of movement of the mission since its establishment. And the Council and the international community have failed to mention the shortcomings of the mission, and this has granted an opportunity for the Houthis to use the city of Hadeda and the ports to threaten international navigation, as well as imperiling international national peace and security. The Yemeni people have been endeavoring to establish a strategy of economic reforms, financial and administrative reforms in a comprehensive way in light of the economic situation, which is difficult. This is currently being endured by Yemen in the suspension of oil exports as a result of attacks by Houthis against oil facilities. And export ports have stripped the Yemeni government and people of a vital economic and resource, and stripped them of opportunities of revenues. We have lost 55% of our of revenues in this way, and the government is not in a position to provide these basic services and to pay public official servant salaries in a regular way. There have been the budget deficit has continued to worsen, 50% reduction. The rate of inflation has continuously risen. There has skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. The national currency has deteriorated. Basic services are not being provided. The recent escalation and the activities by Houthis in the Red Sea and the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb have suspended the commercial flow and resulted in price rises for goods as a result of the increase in the prices of fuel and maritime transport. And this has worsened living standards and did further deteriorated the conditions for the Yemeni people. Poverty rates have reached 78%, unemployment is 35%, and basic services have continuously withered, and the economic situation and the humanitarian situation has continuously deteriorated as well. Yemen is currently also facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. According to the statistics, 18.2 million people need humanitarian assistance in Yemen, and 17.6 million people have been suffering as a consequence of acute food insecurity in Yemen. The number of forcibly displaced persons has continuously risen, is specifically in the regions controlled, that has reached 4.5 million displaced persons who are living in makeshift camps, and basic the services are lacking there. We wish to take this opportunity to renew the commitment of the Presidential Steering Council and the Yemeni government to shoulder our responsibilities vis-a-vis the Yemeni people, and to ensure the payment of, as well as to support economic, administrative, and financial reforms, comprehensive reforms that have been supported by our brethren and our friends. We reaffirm the fact that the Presidential Steering Council and the Yemeni government has fully taken into account the decisions of the Yemeni government, the Yemeni bank, to protect the Yemeni banking system, to end the monetary distortions, and to counter inflation, as well as to respect the principle of good governance and to improve the oversight of banks, as well as foreign banking transactions, as well as respecting the related to the transactions to counter money laundering and the financing of terrorism. The Houthis have continuously complicated the situation. They have worsened the humanitarian plight of the people, resulting from their escalation systematic economic war waged against the Yemeni people and government. They have been thwarting efforts towards peace, and they have adopted practices to destabilize international peace and security by targeting international navigation in the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden, and this under the pretext of solidarity with the Palestinian people, who for the 9th month have been facing a genocidal war and heinous crimes in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as a consequence of the actions by the Israeli occupying forces. The government of Yemen once again reaffirms the commitment to peace, and we continue to support both regional and international efforts, specifically mediation efforts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman. We support the efforts of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations in allowing the Yemeni people to have an opportunity to and to achieve socioeconomic and cultural growth through a fair and comprehensive peace rooted in the benchmarks of agreed upon political solution, namely the initiatives of the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as its implementation mechanism, and the results of the National Dialogue Conference, as well as Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2216. We applaud the sincere efforts undertaken by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to improve living conditions for the Yemeni people, to achieve peace, to restore institutions, to bring about peace, stability, monetary currency stability. We have been seeing that efforts been undertaken to alleviate humanitarian suffering caused by the Houthis, who have been supported by the Iranian regime. To conclude, today more than ever before, the achievement of peace and end to the conflict in Yemen is an overarching imperative. This is a matter of urgency. This requires a meaningful partnership, which brings the interests of the Yemeni people above other interests, building a political partnership and equality for all Yemeni peoples, renouncing selectivity and the choice of war. To that end, we reaffirm that any peace process needs to be based in national preferences, regional and international as well, and particularly resolutions of the Security Council. And there's a need to respect the legal and political status of the Yemeni state. Any political process needs to be both inclusive and protected by regional and international guarantees. And there's a need for mediation efforts to be undertaken to achieve peace, to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the representative of Yemen for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussions on this subject. The meeting is adjourned.